Johnson.
We'll hang on real quick. That's good.
Hey, there we go. All right. So I got on that time. Now let's see if this one will get on. I'm thinking that maybe our Wi-Fi is having an issue tonight. My Wi-Fi at home, not my wife. My Wi-Fi. Yeah. My internet of things is having a problem at home.
Still says
Upcoming? This one says it's live. Yeah. I guess I could always pull it up on my phone. I just have to be able to see. All right. So this is like it's like a culmination of a lot of stuff that we've done up to this point. It gets a little bit technical in the historical part, but I do think it's fair to investigate some of the historical pieces of theology, of Christology. I'll try to keep you out of the weeds a little bit, but I can't guarantee it. The literature this week does he makes one unfortunate consistent error, and I don't know why, because it's simply in the translation of a word, and it's an easy word. I don't know why he missed it. Never have understood why he missed it, and don't understand why he didn't change it when he went back to edit. But he translated a word that just means form, and he translated it into nature, and that causes all types of problems in his teaching. So but don't worry, I'll fix him as we go. So I'll show you what I'm talking about once we get into the passage. All right, unity of the person of Christ. All right, there we are. All right, so I'll pray and then we'll get started. God, thank you so much for the day of worship and the day of grace that you've given us. Thank you for the calling that you place on our lives to be in relationship and be obedient disciples. I pray that you will help us to stand for your kingdom, stand firm for your truth, and be used by you in whatever way that you see fit. God, we thank you and we love you. Thank you for this evening. I pray that you'll teach us more of an understanding of you tonight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay. All right. So the pathway that he takes through here is the importance and the difficulty of the issue, which is the unity of the person of Christ. Then we're going to look at some biblical stuff. Then we're going to have like 6 different heresies. I told you all several weeks ago, this is like heresy central. So this is, it's heresy, 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 heresy. If you open up your mouth to talk about Jesus, heresy. So that's just what happened for a few hundred years in Christian history. So we're going to go through, it's like 6 different heresies. I'll treat the first couple a little bit deeper than the last ones because it gets a little bit repetitive. There's one that he calls Gnosticism. It's the Greek word is ekinosis, and so that's what it's called, Gnosticism. And that one I will take a little bit more time on because it's a passage or two that you guys are going to be partly familiar with already. And I want to make sure that we start to look at the passage and understand what it actually means. And then he closes out with his basic tenets of a doctrine of the 2 natures in one person. So all this section is going. Oh, Yogi's online. Hey, Yogi.
Oh, good.
I see you. So good. Really what the concept for tonight is somebody must have beeped. He said, please turn off all your devices because the professor is speaking. So, hey, Steve is coming in. Can y'all make a easy hole for him here?
it's too crowded.
No, we're no, hang out there.
You're at the end of the table.
No, he's not at the end of the table. He's at the beginning of the table. That's right. Thank you for being the head of the table, Steve. So that's right. All right. So really the focus of this chapter is to look at the concept of the deity of Christ, which we did last week, and 2 weeks ago, then the humanity of Christ, which we did last week. And then, of course, the obvious question comes: how are they one? How are both of these natures? How do they blend into one? So, since we've thoroughly gone through, the idea of his divinity and his humanity, it becomes a very difficult situation if you let it eat you up. And he says it's one of the three most difficult theological problems that we have, which is Trinity, which hopefully you guys understand Trinity in a very simplistic way, because that's what we went through at the beginning of the course. I don't think it's that hard. And then he lists this one and the relationship of human free will with divine sovereignty, which I don't think that's very difficult either. But those are the three big difficulties that most people have with Christian theology. And this one is probably the most difficult, not so much because of the difficult nature of the concept, but it's more so difficult in how do you speak it? How do you voice what has happened? And that's where the theological part gets very difficult, because how do you say it? How do you say what has happened? Personally, and I've told you all this before, I think what John said in John chapter 1 is perfect, and it is sufficient. The Word became flesh. Okay, that's what John says. The Word became flesh, and that's the way the Bible defines the unity of the two natures of Christ. Now, the reason this becomes a problem is that this concept becomes a problem is because you have necessity for divinity in Jesus, and you have the necessity for humanity in Jesus. In order for redemption to be profitable for mankind, then Jesus had to be human, because he had to be able to die as a sacrifice. He had to fulfill the Levitical law. He had to then fulfill what God had demanded, what he himself had written. He had to be able to fulfill those things. That's only going to happen if he's human. But if he's not divine, then we have a man who would be sinful, dying for mankind, which that would not be a proper sacrifice. So within the self-manifested laws that God himself wrote, that Jesus wrote, then he has to be both fully man, fully human. So then the question becomes, how is he a unified God-man? All right. So that's sort of the difficult nature of it. Now, I want to give a note. This is my own little, and if you saw my book, it has a lot of pencil marks through it. A lot of editorials that I'm going to send him at some point. So this is what you should have said. Right. Said it right. But it's my own little notes. But this note I wanted to give you all. So I want you to understand that this discussion, this is what I said. This discussion, taken too seriously and legally, can tend to remove the spiritual omnipotence of God. Okay? Meaning God can do what he wants to do. If he wants to make it happen, he can make it happen. As if we could deny God's decree of effective salvation simply because we find a crack, or we're not able to identify proper incarnational verbiage and logic to describe what he has done. I find it to be a little bit hubris. I think it shows a lack of humility on our side to say, well, see, that doesn't work. I'm sorry, God. That just doesn't work. You can't be both man and God at the same. That does not work. It just, so if we take this to the degree where we have to prove it logically, then you've actually sort of called yourself God, and you're making God play by your own rules. So it does work out if you follow, because we do want to be able to explain what truth is. We want to be able to explain what happened, but you also have to come to the realization that you're probably not going to be able to find the words that properly explain what God did. All right. So we'll walk down this pathway, and you'll see how trepidatious you sort of need to be when you're writing about the unity of the human nature and the divine nature within Jesus Christ, because we have a long trail of heretics that have been produced along the way. All right. So let's see. He goes through. He says, okay, so here we're trying to combine these two natures. Here's the problem that we have, because it's contradictory in nature. If he's God, I don't like the ifs, because that adds a conditional. I'll take it as a second-class conditional statement, which means that the obvious is accepted. And so I'll say, since he is God, we know certain things. We know that he can do all things. We know that he can be everywhere at any time. We know that he is all powerful, but since he's also human, he's limited in knowledge. He grows in knowledge. He cannot do everything. He can only be in one place at one time, and he's limited because of space and time. All right. So there is the contradiction. If he's one, he supposedly can't be the other at the same time, because saying that the same entity can be both finite and infinite simultaneously seems to be impossible to our mind. So that is a sort of the basis for the problem that's inherent in the unity of Christ, the unity of two natures in Christ. Another problem that he lines out, he says, look, this is a problem. There's not really that much biblical scriptural support or even conversation about his natures, his human nature, his divine nature, much less the unity of the two. Now, I gave him the reason in the side column of my book why that is, and it's just there's a good reason for that. That wasn't the point. He wasn't writing a theological treatise whenever the Bible was being written. It was a relational treatise. Anytime that anytime that you say, well, I wish he would have just preserved this. If he just would have preserved the ark, then we would know that there really was a flood. Right? If he just would have preserved the robe that Jesus was in, if he just would have preserved this, or if there's a necessity of faith in the relationship that we have with Christ. He doesn't want us to go on knowledge. If you recall, he rebukes Thomas, chapter 20-ish of John, because Thomas says, I want to stick my hands in and fingers and blah, 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 blah. And then he sees Jesus and says, my Lord, my God. Jesus says, you have believed because you have seen, but blessed are those who will believe without having seen. Ours is empowered by faith. Righteousness is empowered by faith. Abraham was counted righteousness because of his faith. And so if you wait on your performance of all things, then you're trying to prove your own righteousness. And in the same aspect, if you have to have evidence of all things before you believe it, then you've ruined your potential for faith. Now, I think that when you have faith in something, God will then reveal it as knowledge. He'll prove it. So you no longer have to live in faith with certain things. Faith is the first step, but he proves it as knowledge on the second step, which then challenges you to push yourself further in the next step of faith, which he will then prove in knowledge, which challenges you then to take another step of faith, and just continues on. But faith is always supposed to be the predecessor to knowledge. as opposed to what a lot of people in the West want to do, which is knowledge has to precede faith, because I have to approve of something before I will believe in it. Well, you don't need to believe in it after you've proven it. If you're sitting in the chair, does someone have to prove to you that's going to hold you up? No, you've already sit in it. You're already sitting in it, so you don't have to have faith in it. You've already been there. So there's no need for faith anymore. If knowledge is the predecessor to faith, then you don't have faith. You just have knowledge. All right? Does that make sense? All right. So I think there's a reason why there are no direct statements about the relationship between the two natures. One, it wasn't really gerund to the conversations that they were having. It wasn't theological treatise, so there's reasons for it. Anyway, so we go into this section. He says, here is what we do have with biblical material. He says, we begin by noting the absence of any reference to the duality. So now he goes through this pathway to say, well, there's no negation of it. He doesn't talk about duality of his nature. He doesn't talk about being human on this day and God on this day. So since he doesn't talk about it, then we shouldn't assume that he's God on one day and human on the next. And Scripture actually on the other side uses some interesting grammar when talking about God. One that he points out, which is a very poor one, Genesis 1:26. Then God said, in the singular, which is not exactly true. God said, "Let us make man in our image." Now he says in the book, he says, "Then God said," and they put singular. I don't know if you're following. He's a singular. The problem is that's the Hebrew word Elohim, the word God. God said Elohim. Well, El is the singular, and hello, Elohim is plural. God is plural. Now, then he says, "Let us make man in our image." There's several things going on there. I really despise this verse when it's used to talk about a multiplicity of understanding of God or forbearing to the Trinity, because any imperial person, a king, where the king speaks, he'll oftentimes speak in the plural. We have decided. He'll talk about the crown has decided, but then it's almost always in the plural. We have decided. We have decided. Well, let me tell you, he's the king. There ain't no we in that decision. It was an I. But because of his imperial nature, grammar has typically taken it in multiplicity of languages that the king speaks in we. He speaks in plural, not because of his person, but because of his power. And so whenever there's a huge amount of power, that person will speak in plural. That's what's happening here. Now, he makes a blunder because he says, "Then God said," and says singular. Well, the word God is Elohim, which is plural. Now, Hebrew does the same thing. El is God. Elohim is gods, or one all-powerful God. And so, again, the Hebrew uses plural to talk about numbers, but it also uses a plural to talk about magnitude. All right. So the plural in the Hebrew can be with, as far as a bunch of people, or it can be a height, meaning magnitude of the one. And so whenever they use Elohim, it's referring to a magnitude of awesomeness of power. There's a couple times in the Hebrew, it's really interesting. It says like he's the God above gods. It's the Elohim above Elohims, which so uses the same word. Obviously, he's not talking about gods above gods. There's just the Hebrew context is this magnificent God is over all the multitude of gods. And so you have this picture. So anyway, that passage is not a good one to use, but there are plenty others that do similar things. Specifically, whenever Jesus is praying, for example, he's praying to God, or whenever it's baptism, you have the first person of the Trinity speaking. You have the third person of the Trinity coming down as a dove, and you have the second person there being baptized. You have statements of in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So you have a multiplicity within the unity of God. John 17, whenever Jesus is praying, he said, may they be unity as we are unity. And so, I mean, there's plenty of other places where you can see where Jesus speaks of himself in a singular, but yet is inclusive of multiple natures, if you want to call it. Or complexity is the term that Dr. Erickson uses here. Let's see. Oh yeah. So there's some passages that he pulls out here to talk about passages that allude to the deity and the humanity of Christ at the same time. The one that we've already sort of discussed, John 1:14, and the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, full of grace and truth. So you have the Word became, the Logos became flesh. So God became, so you have both sides there. Made his dwelling, he tabernacled among us. So that means he's actually walking, talking in the flesh. And then he says, full of grace and truth. Well, that's God. That's not mankind. So you have this both existing at the same time, not directly, but molded together. Galatians 4:4, God sent his son, born of a woman under the law. So then you have God, his progeny, born of a woman, born under the law. So you have both the deity and the humanity put together. I like this one, 1 Timothy 3:16, because it compares not only his earthly existence in the flesh, but also his heavenly existence. It says, he appeared in body. So he, being God in second person, appeared in a body, was vindicated by the Spirit, was seen by the angels, was preached by the nations, was preached among the nations, was believed on in the world, and was taken up into glory. So here you have this cool statement of Paul given to Timothy, saying he's flesh and he's spirit, he's on earth and he's in heaven. Yeah, James.
And what does that phrase, vindicated by the Spirit, what does that mean?
Vindicated means what you said is right. All right. So whenever he came back to life, I take that phrase to be whenever he came back to life, that he was vindicated by the Spirit, meaning he said this is going to happen, and this is indeed what happened. Yeah. You can also, on a larger scale, that passage can be taken to say all the prophecies of the Old Testament have come true in what Jesus has done while he was walking. That's also the vindication of the Spirit. The Spirit made all these prophecies in the Old Testament. Jesus walked them and performed them in the New Testament. I think it's because of the way he's, this sort of progression in time that Paul is giving. He appeared in the body, vindicated in the Spirit, seen by the angels, preached among the nations. He's sort of going in this pathway, and the resurrection seems to fall in that line right there. Right. So I think he's talking about the resurrection, but it could also be the prophecies of the Old Testament vindicated in the New Testament, which, by the way, when people say, well, why did Jesus come? People jump to like salvation and stuff. But the real reason Jesus came was to testify the truth. That's his statement that he makes to Pilate. Pilate asked him, so you are a king. He says, well, you're right. You say this right. It is for this reason and for this purpose that I have come, to testify to the truth. So testifying to the truth goes to what you said, vindicated by the Spirit. He's saying that all the things said about me in the past are true. All the things that were prophesied, all the things that were created, everything that I have done, all the law that I've written, everything that I've said is vindicated in me. And I'm the one testifying that all that I said, I have now done. And the things that have not happened yet, I will complete later. He came to testify to the truth.
So 3:16 really is just speaking about his lifespan. I mean, it's telling all that, but it's actually starts out appeared in the flesh and ends up
taking glory, the ascension. Yeah.
Yes. Just like this synopsis.
Yeah, and so that's why I think Paul is doing. That's why I say vindicated by the Spirit. And this, I think he's talking about the resurrection. But it could be because vindicated by the Spirit, could be all the things that he did while he was walking. So I mean, I could go with either one. I'm not going to be mad at either of those interpretations, but it's the process that Paul sees from his birth to his death.
My hill to die on.
It's not my hill to die on. It's one of the two. I don't care which one. That's right. That's right. Not mine. That's right. That's right. Yes. Yeah. That'd be ugly. All right. So, okay. So he also pulls up some passages that points to this unified idea of Jesus. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 16 to 18 says, in this one body that he unites Jews and Greeks, in this one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who were far away and peace to those who were near. For through him, we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. So now we have Father, Spirit, Son, first, second, third person of the Trinity. But he says in this one body, talking about his human body, but yet including himself as deity. So here again, you have this unification of natures between the spiritual and the humanity. 1 John 2:1-2 says, but if anybody does sin, we have one who speaks to the Father in our defense, Jesus Christ the righteous. He is the atoning sacrifice for our sins, and not only for ours, but also for the sins of the whole world. So now that puts this unification of Jesus' fleshly, human nature death on the cross, but yet he is present with the Father to make intercession. So there's this divine nature, again, coalescing in one. So we can see just this almost a presupposition of deity and humanity mixed into one, that John and the writers of the New Testament, they saw it and they knew it and they understood it to the point that they didn't think they really had to address it. It was, to them, it was somewhat obvious in nature. So y'all get up to there? Okay. He goes into a section then about his titles. I don't think that's a great proof, just because you're using parallels and titles as opposed to actuality. But he uses some, ruler of the age. He uses he uses son of man, and I have a mild issue with son of man because the Hebrew term is baranash. Baranash could be used to just say me or I, but it also is a term used for the Messiah. Jesus used it. I used to know this. I think it's like 78 times or something like that in the Gospels. Like 20 to 30 of them, it was just him saying I. Like, I will do this. Not exactly messianic. The bulk of them were straight up messianic, but not all of them. And it was a typical term that people would use because Easterners don't like to talk about themselves. For example, whenever we lived in Japan, the word I is watashi. So if you say I am going, you say watashi wa ikimasu. So watashi wa. And so I learned this because, in English, if you're talking about yourself, wow, how many times do we say I, right? It's in almost probably half the sentence. And I know exactly. I don't know either. But I noticed in talking to Japanese people, nobody ever used watashi wa. It's like, and they would just say going to the store or eating dinner. Shorthand, yeah. But they did that because the Eastern concept is you don't use I because you're drawing attention to yourself. Now that means in conversation, you have to understand that they're talking about themselves. Going to the store. Well, who's going to the store? Oh, that would be you. You're going to the store. But then I can't say you are either. I can't say that because now I'm drawing attention back to them. So it was just like going to the store. I was like, oh, going to the store. But they don't like using the I. So you find a different way to say I. Well, for the Hebrew, it was Barnash. It was son of man. I am, but it's son of man. And so they would use this term just to say I. And everybody used it. It wasn't just Jesus. So everybody was not claiming to be the Messiah. It was just a way to avoid saying me, right? Just as a cultural thing. So I don't like that to say. I don't like the Son of Man to use as a definite statement that that's the messianic phrase. It is when applied to Daniel, but just because you use it doesn't mean it's always messianic. So. I'm just saying that there's other proofs. All right. So if you're going to use one that always works. Don't pick a bad one. There's plenty of good ones. Don't pick a bad one. It's sort of like some of my progressive friends that always pick bad heroes in society. They'll pick a bad person that becomes a poster child of a movement, and they're a bad person. I'm like, there's so many good people that you could have picked that did the same thing. Pick a better person. Don't pick a bad person. Don't pick a bad proof. Pick a good proof. There's plenty of them. It seems that's the way it goes. Yeah. All right. So that gives you some biblical support. But again, the Bible doesn't speak directly to this concept. So we have to look at what the Bible doesn't say, meaning it doesn't say that Jesus was sometimes human, sometimes divine. It doesn't say there was a blending of those natures. It doesn't say that he lived his childhood as a human and he became divine later. So it doesn't say those things, but arguments from a void never work out very well. So it's not a proof, it's just some support. But then you have these other occasions where the Godhead is represented as coexistent, not only between themselves, but also between the divine and the human. And so it's not direct, but it sort of supports the concept. Okay. And none of it ever negates it. Okay. No good? That's all I got for the biblical part. Everything else is going to be theological. That's a bad thing. But that's where we're going to go with this. All right. So I told y'all several weeks ago, there's a progression of theological fights that happened. And the Christological fight didn't happen until much later in history. So you're into the 300s and the 400s before we have these Christological fights. The early arguments for something different. Is more like salvation, arguing between Judaism and the new Christianity, arguing between the law and salvation, arguing before the traditions and let's say Paul, not really Paul, but the Gospels. Those were the early arguments. And that was because everything they were doing was spreading the gospel. They were constantly going out, sharing the gospel. They were dying for their faith. They were illegal and they were running. And they had one goal in mind, and that was to share the gospel because it wasn't safe. They didn't have any time to think theologically. They didn't have time to develop structures and all these things. Well, once the Roman Empire became Christian, they had plenty of time to start thinking because everybody became Christian like that. So, gosh, we don't need to share the gospel anymore because the emperor said you're a Christian, so you must be a Christian. So the normal people were no longer sharing the gospel. Now the priests were the ones who were the only ones that were able to really look at the scriptures and make decisions. So it really messed up the church. But at that point, they were able to start digging deeper into who Jesus was. So the progression was God, then salvation, then God, then Jesus. But first, let's talk about him being divine. So there's an argument about him being divine. Those are also the first heresies because they were arguing against his divinity. Well, once they felt like they had his divinity pretty solid, then you get his humanity. And so the next heresies are the heresies about his humanity. he was not human, or what his humanity was, or how he was blended. So that's the second set of heresies, because they were arguing about his humanity. Once they got to the point of saying, okay, he's divine and he's human, now the next set of heresies deal with how those things are united, right? That's just the way it progressed. And so now we're at 325. I think 325 was Nicaea. Yep. Council of Nicaea was in 325 AD. And that is whenever they've said, hey, we know he's divine. We know he's human. That is what orthodoxy is. And then they start saying, well, what does that really mean? What is meant by declaring that Jesus is fully God and fully human? All right. First at bat, coming to bat from the home team is Dr. Nestor. So there's this guy named Nestorius, who I really like. And actually, he became a really good missionary to the Far East. He converted a lot of Chinese, and the Chinese picked up a lot of Christian concepts because of this guy. But he only went there because he was also thrown out of the church and called a heretic. What do you know? So here's his first guy, Nestorius. And Nestorius is sort of like John Calvin, in that John Calvin did not believe in Calvinism. He never taught Calvinism. What was accredited to John Calvin as Calvinism was actually his followers, Beza and some of the others that came after John Calvin. They were the ones that then created the Calvinistic concepts that we consider Calvinism. Same thing with Nestor. Nestorius probably didn't believe what was Nestorianism. His followers sort of proclaimed it. They took some of his teachings and expanded from it. I will tell you that as I look at what Nestorianism is, I'm not really sure what it is. I don't really know. It's sort of amorphous. This is the first, I think, and I'm going to explain to you what Nestorianism is. I'm sort of kidding about that. But Nestorianism was not as much a heresy as it was a power play within the church. Here's the first, as far as I can tell, this is probably the first political upheaval doctrine that's thrown out, and a group of people that are thrown out because of politics. And so Nestorius comes up, and he was named as, what was he named as? He was he's in Constantinople. What was his title? Patriarch of Constantinople. All right. So 428, Nestorius is the Patriarch of Constantinople, which means he's the leader of the church. Now, if you know any history, Constantinople becomes the seat of the Eastern Papacy later. So he is sort of equal to what would be called the Pope. All right. So here we are, is this guy. He's leading this Eastern church, but there's other people, namely Cyril, that don't like him, and so he has political enemies. And here comes this case in front of him that he had to make a decision about. Now, in the Nicene Creed, and which retained its authority through the 400s here, you have this phrase about Mary. And the phrase was Theotokos, God bearer, the bearer of God. So it's talking about Mary being, born of a virgin, Mary, blah, 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 and that she was the Theotokos, the bearer, the one who bore God, the bearer of God. And so this lawsuit, I guess you could say, came up before him to be decided whether or not the term Theotokos was appropriate or not. And he didn't want to agree with Theotokos. He said only way that you should have Theotokos is if you also have Anthropotokos, which is bearer of man. Anthropos is man, Theo is God, Tokos is the bearer. So Theotokos is bearer of God, Anthropotokos is the bearer of man. He wanted it to be he said you have to have them both together. And so what generated out of this legal case, have y'all ever read like a judge's decision? Aren't they thrilling?
Difficult.
I mean, there's there's a secret to reading it. The secret is read the heading and go to the very last sentence of the whole thing, 50 to 80 pages later, because on the last sentence will say, "Therefore, I find for the defendant." That's really what it does. And in the middle, it's like, what are you saying? A whole bunch of words. And so Nestorius notably was not a good writer, was vague in the words that he used, and wasn't really accurate with the words that he used to describe what his thoughts were. But what he said in his decision was Mary did not bear God, rather she bore a man who was a vehicle for God. All right. So he said, look, okay, so get what he's saying. This could be taken as a Buddhist concept. This could be taken as all types of bad stuff because he didn't use really precise verbiage. But what he's saying is that God needed to become flesh. And so for his purpose, he had to assume flesh. And so man became his vehicle for doing it. He's trying to go down an orthodox path. He just didn't do it. And so what happened was he said, you can't have this term Theotokos because it affirms, like it can affirm an Arian heresy. It can affirm an Apollinarius heresy. He said, this is not good to use it that way. So he decided on the other direction. And whenever he made that decision, then there were some others, namely Cyril, who was from Alexandria. Now, at the time, so really there's a reason for me doing this. All right, I'm taking it into Christian history for purpose. Cyril was from Alexandria. Nestorius was from Constantinople. There were three main places that were battling for supremacy in the Christian church: Rome, Constantinople, and Alexandria. Those were the three homes to Christianity. Yep.
Egypt.
Yeah, Egypt, Alexandria, Egypt. Yep. Oddly named after the Greek king who conquered it. Alexandria is beautiful. It's my favorite. It's the only city I like in Egypt. But Alexandria is really nice. And they had a huge library. And Athanasius is from there. I mean, all this great thinking from Alexandria. Well, there's a political battle between Alexandria and Constantinople and Rome. Rome is sort of falling down a little bit. Constantinople is popping up. Alexandria wants to take that position. Cyril sees an opportunity to say, well, that guy in Constantinople is wrong. And so here we go. And he uses Eusebius, who was then also another patriarch. And so here comes this argument based on political nature. And so once we get to the Council of Ephesus in 431, this statement that Nestorius had made was condemned as a heresy. But even at that point, there was no real reason for it. Nestorius was trying to explain himself, but it was really political maneuvering that Cyril used by getting more of his own priests there to say, yes, that's heresy. So if you read what Nestorius wrote years later, which by the way, like 20 or 30 years later, he was allowed back in the church. But if you read his writings, all he was saying was, look, I think there is a conjunction instead of a union between the two. And again, maybe not a good use of words, but his idea of union was this entanglement, whereas conjunction for him meant it was both at the same time. Again, it's a nuance, completely a nuance. But by that political move really moved a lot of the Christian thought and center of theology more solidly into Alexandria as opposed to Constantinople, which a couple hundred years later, Islam comes through and wipes it out anyway. So Now it's all gone. So now I said that because and I'm not going to take as long on any of the others as I did just on Nestorius, but this is a reason why I said a few weeks ago, I don't judge harshly those who are called heretics. Historically, I don't know if the heretics are heretics. I'm fully expecting to see this guy hanging out in heaven whenever I get there. Hey, Nestorius, how you doing? How's that whole Theotokos working out for you? Yes, yeah, it could be. Yeah, that's right. So, wow, that's bad. But just be careful whenever you listen to people. Don't beat them up over a word use or a choice. Find out what they actually mean, and because sometimes the word choice is not the best one. Give a little bit of grace as you're talking to people. All right, that's all I'm saying. That's why I wanted to bring up this pathway of Nestorius. Nestorius was still used in a great way. His people were actually a bigger problem than he was. His people got offended that he got kicked out, and they caused problems because they were mad that their guy got kicked out. Nestorius was like, hey, that's cool. I'm going to take this Jesus thing in the gospel elsewhere, and I'm going to do my work that I've been called to do. And he did. And later he was accepted back into the church anyway. So it's like, whatever. His followers got mad, not because of the theology of it, but because of the political nature of it. Their guy got kicked out, and so they caused a problem within the church. That's why I don't think we should take these terms, heresy and all that stuff, so seriously, because you start causing problems, you make more divisions within the church than you do unity. Okay? Good. Now, I'm not going to do as much on any of the others, but you still have these same people that are playing out at the same time, because now, okay, so I said 431, this decision gets made about Nestorius, and so they have this thing, well, you can't do this. Well, his people are mad, and so they have another council 2 years later. This is still Cyril and Eutychius. Now, Eutychius was saying, yeah, let's throw out Nestorius, but then he makes a statement because now the political momentum has changed a little bit because all Nestor's people are getting angry. And so they're like, hey, let's make a compromise. Eutychius says, hey, we can't make a compromise because, by the way, I'm the one that wrote all that stuff about Nestorius. So if you're compromising, then you're actually putting me at liable. And so now there's another fight. You see what happens here? So whichever way the political battle goes, that's who gets called a heretic. And so Cyril says, okay, let's compromise a little bit. Eutychius says, but you've compromised too much. You've gone too much into Nestorianism. You're going to walk into this. So here's this fight that goes on again, right? And all of this was about whether there's two natures or one nature. I do agree with orthodoxy in that we really should not talk about Jesus having two natures, because that splits him into two thought processes. It makes him a Frankenstein of some sorts. And that's really what all this is about. And make sure that's not a comment coming here. Yep, okay. Cyril then dies, and there's this big fight about the position that they're having. Here comes Eutychius. Eutychius says that you can't have the two natures. That's contrary to the biblical norm. But Eutychius also is not very precise or clear in his thinking. So he writes several things that don't go along with each other. And what ends up happening is a few years later, 451, so 20 years later, the church says, hey, that Nicene Creed, I think that sounded actually pretty good. Let's go back to that. Okay, so they revert back. Now, what they're going to do is they say, okay, let's revert back to this, and instead of saying what Jesus is, since we're throwing people out of the church and it's really becoming a mockery and becomes a political turmoil, can we figure out a different way to do it? And so they have meeting, and then finally they start this one meeting at Chalcedon. Chalcedon actually lasts, I think, for like 18 years from the beginning to the end. So one meeting, right? And they didn't stay there for 18 years, but they stayed for a couple months. They left. They wrote letters back and forth. They came back and came back, kept on writing, kept on writing. And so the statement that they ended up with about Jesus is this. This is called the Chalcedonian Creed. This is a portion of the Chalcedonian Creed. It says,
I got the book.
You got the book. All right. So this is going to be in the section about just after Eutychianism. And it's probably in italics.
665.
Okay. There he is, 665. Hope. Thank goodness it's not on page 666. There it is. There it is. All right. So here's what their statement, the Chalcedonian Creed, says about Jesus. One and the same Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten, made known in two natures without confusion, without change, without division, without separation, the difference of the natures being by no means removed because of the union, but the property of each nature being preserved and coalescing in one prosopion and one hypostasis, not parted or divided into two prosopa, but one and the same Son, only begotten, divine Word, the living Jesus Christ, as the prophets of old and have taught us about him, and the creed of our fathers has handed down. Is that direct? That's real direct, right? Don't you love that one? Don't you want to memorize that for Sunday school? All right. Now, what they ended up doing, they didn't want to walk into another heresy. And everything that they did, they realized they were arguing about how to state who Jesus was and how he became human and divine into one without having like a strand wrapped in another strand or a mix or a composite or 1/3, 2/3, because you can't divide three pieces in half. I mean, that doesn't work very well. So how do we explain it? So what they decided to do, it's called the sine qua non. Sine qua non means without this, there is nothing. And so what they did, they said, here are the borders within which you can talk about Jesus. So they didn't say what he is. They just said what you can't say about him. Okay. So they said, you can't say this. They never said what you can say. They said what you can't say. And so they said, make sure that whenever you talk about him, he's, one and the same, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. The differences in the nature being no means removed because of the union, blah, 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 blah. All right. So what they basically said is, we have no idea. No clue.
It's pretty weak, actually.
It's extremely weak. But the Chalcedonian Creed is the same creed that still is considered to be orthodoxy. Because there still is no better way than I think John said the Word became flesh. I think we can just go back to the Word became flesh. How did it happen? Somewhere in there is God. The Word became flesh. That's what I know. The Word became flesh. So people call it a problem. I don't see it as a problem. I think we already have our answer. The Word became flesh. I think that's a pretty good explanation. I'm good with that, right? Otherwise, you have all this verbal garbage that just, man, it's like, what do you mean by this? Did y'all really sign off on this? Are you kidding me? And y'all took 18, 20 years to come up with this? A whole bunch of, I guess so. So anyway, the main phrase in that whole Chalcedonian Creed is without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. Because they really wanted you to understand that those two seemingly different natures, the divine and the human, became one without any distinction between them. You could not find a human part of Jesus, and you could not find a divine part of Jesus. You could only find Jesus. Okay? But I'm not going to tell you how. And don't you dare try to describe it, because you'll be a heretic if you do. All right. All right. So you'll get there. So that's sort of the progression of time over a couple hundred years. You about to ask something?
No.
Just stretching. Okay. All right. So that was a couple hundred years. That gets us to, I think, like 470 or something is whenever they finally published that thing. Um, and that's going to be sort of the end of it, because if you know history, um, now we're going into the dark ages and the time of Islam coming up. Is Muhammad, that's 632, and then he wipes across all of northern Africa, which is at that point the heart of the thought of Christianity, and he becomes a threat to Jerusalem. And well, not him because he's dead, but Islam becomes a threat to Jerusalem and Constantinople, and so they have something else to worry about instead of Christian theology. Now they have survival, and so theology goes out the window for 1,000 years. Okay, so that's why I said Chalcedon is really the last statement of theology until you get to the Reformation. Not quite the Reformation, but not too far from it. So now there are 4 other attempts, which they're sort of the same type of thing. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. Adoptionism. Adoptionism is that Jesus was born human. Let me define it. Adoptionism is 2 natures, one nature starting with, and it then adopts a second nature that then blends into one. All right. So the idea is Jesus was born as flesh, and then at some point later, almost everybody agrees, baptism. At his baptism, he becomes the Christ. Right. So he's Jesus of Nazareth until the baptism. Then he's Jesus the Messiah at the baptism. All right. That's adoptionism. That's when God adopted Jesus as his son. All right. They use like Hebrews, the statement, this is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased, listen to him, that statement, that type of statement, but also Hebrews, where the writer quotes and says, today I have adopted you. This is my son. Today I have adopted you. They use that, or no, today you've become my son. They use that passage to say this is adoptionism, right? That obviously was thrown out. You're my son. The next one, oh, gosh, I hate this one. Anhypostatic Christology. So anhypostatic. So the phrase hypostatic, the union. You're gonna love this one. So the way that theologians describe the Chalcedonian Creed, without division, without separation, is a hypostatic union. The hypostatic union, it's a circular definition, because the only way you can define hypostatic union is by understanding what a hypostatic union is. Hypostatic union, basically, it's a punt to say it just is this way. Don't ask me a question about it. Okay, that's what hypostatic means. Hypostatic union is only applicable to what happened to Jesus, which has no definition. Do you get it? All right. So hypostatic, the way you define hypostatic union is with an undefined union.
So like from his human self, and then that connection as God as well
Mm-hmm.
in man.
Yeah.
That manifestation that's not able to be explained by
Right.
the man.
That's hypostatic union. Yeah. Yeah. So the unexplained union, that's a good way to say it. The unexplainable union that we know happened to make him all God and all flesh.
Yeah.
That's the definition of hypostatic union. But that term itself is undefined because there's no definition for what it is. Right. So that's and it's only applied to Jesus in that God-man combination. So that's hypostatic union. So in hypostatic union, in hypostatic Christology means, it didn't happen that way.
That's just a way to print.
It is. But you have to come up with a word that explains it. I don't think it's that hard. In the Latin, you have these 2 terms, essentia and natura. You have essence and nature. Nature is like some attributes, and the essence is who you really are. And the Latin in Chalcedon, apart from this discussion, what they settled with, they talked a lot about the essentia of the person, the essence of who you are. And so when they're you know how like we have the Constitution, but then you have the Federalist Papers, and you can look and read the Constitution, and you say, well, what did you actually mean? You go to Federalist paper and go, oh, that's what you meant. Thanks, Mr. Hamilton. Yeah.
Or like deification, like as a deity. In like even like other religions, when you look at like the gods, the
Yeah.
goddesses in like a
Hinduism.
deifying
Yeah.
way. Yeah. I don't know. I guess like that is kind of like the only word you could use for that though.
It is.
I don't know.
Yeah, because there's nothing else that happens that way.
Yeah.
I mean, closest would maybe be like a avatar,
Yeah.
but they would never say that their avatars are actually Brahman,
Right.
the
Like
Hindu
in
god.
Greek mythology, they do have some words for that, but those don't actually work out in the real.
Right, because those are lowercase gods. They're not
Yeah.
Zeus. So same thing. And nobody else really had something like that. So they had to come up with something their own selves. So anyway, anhypostatic Christology says that the man Jesus had no, he didn't exist. He didn't have a subsistence. He doesn't have an essence apart from the Jesus of Nazareth that appeared. So it's not like it was forever God in the past, forever God in the future. It was just a momentary appearance of God. So it wasn't really a union. It was just a temporary binding. All right. So let's pitch that one out. The one that I do want to talk about, just because it applies to a passage that y'all will read and y'all will question, and that's canonicism. Canonicism, which I just know as the canonic theory. It promulgates this term. It's called the canonic theory. It's Philippians chapter 2, verse 7 is where it really comes out. Jesus made himself nothing. He emptied himself is another translation. King James, I think, says emptied himself. And so the argument is, well, that Jesus emptied himself. This is a 19th century. This is the 1800s, by the way. So we just jumped, like I said, not much happened in between this time frame. Now we're in the 1800s with the canonic theory, and they go back looking, and this is Reformation time, and they're like, okay, so what happened with this emptying? What did he empty himself of? Okay, you just went one step too far, because the Bible doesn't say he emptied himself of something. It just says he emptied himself. Doesn't say what he emptied himself of. Well, they wanted to go a step farther and say, well, what did he empty himself of? He must have emptied himself of his godship, his divinity. That's what he must have emptied himself of. So, they go through this process to say, so if he emptied himself of his Godhead, what did he become, and so on and so forth. Now, the Dr. Erickson says, this is where I don't know why he does this. He says, according to this view, what Jesus emptied himself of was the form of God, morphe theo, which is true, the form of God. But then when he argues it, he calls it nature of God and not the form of God. Now, he's right. The words are correct. And if you look at the passage, Philippians 2:7, he says, he says that he didn't see that his status was something he had to hold on to. He didn't have to cling to it as though it wasn't his. Let me actually read the passage to you before I get myself in trouble here. It's a beautiful passage, and I think it's a blessing. He says, yeah, that's right. This is ESV, but it's a good passage. Have this mind among you, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, that's the morphe theo, okay, form of God. Now, like I said, Erickson changes it and says nature of God. No, it wasn't nature of God. It was a form of God. Now, what was the form of God? Well, whenever we talk about God in the first person, he's spirit. So he's talking about in this other realm, in this other existence that the first person dwells in. You can't see because he's spirit, right? Second person is physical, that deals with the physical. First person spiritual deals with physical. Third person, the one that goes between. So when you talk about the form of God, he's saying unseen, transcendent, just other. completely other, who being in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Okay, this is where people go crazy and they say, well, he must have emptied himself and he lost his equality with God. No, read it the way he says it. He says it's not something that he had to like fight for. I don't have to, here it is. If I am Hoyt, okay, since I am Hoyt, and I dress up as something else, do I lose my Hoytness? Do I have to struggle to maintain my Hoytness? No, because it's who I am. Yeah, I know, right? It is recorded, actually. So there you go. Yeah. I can't lose my Hoytness because that's the nature of who I am, although I might change my form. Hello. So the essence of who I am is my Hoytness. He's saying he doesn't have to cling on to this form because it's who he is. He is God. So why do I have to cling? He doesn't have to stay in the first person. He can demean himself and lock himself into a fleshly body because it doesn't matter. He's still God. It doesn't matter the form that he takes. In essence, that's still who he is. So what he's saying here is, though he was in form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but instead he kenoted himself. He poured himself out. All right, now that word kenosis, it's translated empty. That's true. But if you look at the idea, it's libation. He poured himself out. So a libation offering, you'd say, this is what I brought. You pour it out on the altar and says, all of it's yours. So what he's saying is, as an act of worship, this is what I'm going to do. He kenoted himself. He emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. It doesn't say he emptied himself by no longer being God. It says he changed his form. He was the form of God. He didn't think that was necessary to grasp onto. Like if I come out of this otherly realm, I will stop to being God. I won't be God if I'm up there anymore. He said, I don't need to do that. I am God. Doesn't matter what form I'm in. I can be in the heavenly form or I can be in a fleshly form. And so he says he emptied himself, and here's why he did it. Here's how he did it. By taking the form of a servant. That's the completion of what he emptied himself of. He emptied himself by moving from one form to another form. Not nature, not essence, form. Being born in the word likeness is the word structure. As schemata. So like a blueprint, all right? So it's the drawing of. You can have a drawing on a piece of paper, and then when it actually gets built out, that's your actual structure. He says, in likeness of man, and then being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, which that's what you take a human form for, death on a cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him, bestowed him in the name above every other name. So the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow in heaven, on the earth, under the earth, every to confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. All right. So all of it coalesces back together. Canonic theory says he poured his God stuff off, so that he was no longer God while he was in the form of man. That's not what the passage says. You read the passage the way it was written, what you get is he is so utterly confident in who he is. He is God. So if I am God, I can do anything I want to do. I can go anywhere I want to do. I can take whatever form I want to take. I don't have to stay in the other realmlies. I can take the form of man. I can have the schemata of man, even though in essence I am still God. I can do whatever I want to. Jesus even says it in the gospel. He says, I lay down my life. No one can take my life from me. I am the one that lays it down, and I also can pick it up. If I lay it down, I can pick it up. Why? He says, because I am life. I don't have life. He never says I am living. He doesn't say I have life. He says I am life. And since I am life, I can take up my own life. He has no worry about who he is. He just changes his form. That makes sense? I just don't think it's very hard whenever you understand, when you actually read what it says. I think it's pretty easy. So anyway, that's the canonic theory. Sort of goes off to the side, says he poured out his God part. And the reason they do it is because he makes statements like, I don't know, only the Father knows. He walks places. He gets hungry. He gets tired. He gets beaten, he bleeds, he dies. So all those things, but that's part of he humbled himself, being born in likeness of man, being found in human form. He then humbled himself to match that form.
That's an interesting verse.
Yeah, it is. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, obedient to the form. I have to be obedient to the form. I have to walk. I have to be hungry. I have to eat. Whenever he's a child, he has to pee in his diaper. He has to poop on the floor. I mean, those are things that he has to do, and so that's the. Otherwise, it would be a mockery of his existence if he didn't fully humble to that form. Okay, that makes sense.
What was the reference on that one?
Philippians 2:6 through whatever. Oh yeah. So, this is simply poor translation for some reason. Morphetheo is form of God, not nature attributes. Correct definition. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So there, my note sort of fixes that. All right. So, but I mean, again, it's understandable that someone would make that confusion because he does have to walk places. Satan takes him places. He yields to that because he can't walk. I mean, he can't fly. He's got to walk. All right. So anyway, he goes through those other four. There's another one in there too. Yeah, dynamic incarnation. Let me just say it's not right. We'll move on. All right. So the basic tenets of the doctrine of two natures. So once you see all these other theories that get thrown into, we know that orthodoxy produces this sine qua non, this without division, without separation, all that stuff. Never actually says what he did, how God did it. So how do we come up with a proper doctrine with good tenets? How these two natures are existent in one person. So two natura. The way the Latin, the way they said it was two naturas, two natures, which are characteristics, in one persona, which is this representation, with God's essentia, his essence, the essence of God, within these two natures represented in one body. Okay, how do we do that? He gives like 5 points. I knocked off one of them because I didn't really agree with it. One, the incarnation was more an addition of human attributes than a loss of divine attributes. Now, first reading, I think you probably look at that and go, I don't really like that because I'm adding stuff to something instead. And if you add 3 to 2, you started with 2, you added 3 to it, and so now you have 2 of these and 3 of these. And so when I look at it, I'm like, okay, so I can still define the 2 and the 3 within the 5, right? So I don't like the way he says that because that ends up giving you a blended structure. Because again, I can see the 2, I can see the 3, I know it's 5, but I can still pick out the 2 and I can still pick out the 3. So I don't like the attitude. But what he's aiming at here is that he was already God, and he picked up this union with flesh. All right, so that's what he's actually meaning. And what he's trying to do, I think, is go along with what John says. The Word, God, became flesh. I think that's where he's going to. But again, here I am picking on him, calling him a heretic. At Millard Erickson, he's a heretic. He's blending the nature of God. No, I think what he's doing is trying to say what John said. The Word became flesh. He just probably picked some clumsy words here. All right. And unfortunately, he uses he goes back to that misuse of morphe as nature, as his defense for that. So I think he goes down a poor path. And that section, he also explains the kenosis. I forgot about that. Yeah. So point number 2, the union of the two natures meant that they did not function independently. All right. That's a good statement. The union of those two natures meant that they did not function independently. You do not have a human Jesus saying certain things and a divine Jesus saying other things. If you ever find yourself urged to say, well, that's just the human part of Jesus, go ahead and just slap yourself so somebody else doesn't. Okay? Just don't do it. He doesn't have a human side and a divine side. If you do that, you're going to start walking down, whether you mean it or not, you're going to open up this heretic alley, right? And you're going to meet Nestor on the road to China. So, just when you say, well, that's his human, no, it's not his human side. They are independent of each other. Now he does make some statements in the book that I want to address. One thing I like, he says, the key to understanding the functional limitation of the humanity is understanding he still had all the power. He says, for example, he still had the power to be everywhere, his omnipresence. However, as an incarnate being, he was limited in the exercise of that power by possession of a human body. Now, I would say, instead of he was limited by, I would say he chose to humble himself. It was not a limitation that was put upon him. It was an exercise of his humility that he was practicing. I'm saying the same thing, but the nuance is that it's a chosen thing. At any moment, he said it. If I wanted to, I could call these angels. He knew he could. Through his choice, he humbled himself. It wasn't a limitation. It was self-imposed limitation, but only through his humility, not by a decision that went bad. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. So
No oops.
it wasn't oops. Yeah. So now he said one other thing I want to hit that is, again, maybe it's just picking words, but he says, only gradually did his limited human psyche become aware of who he was and what he had come to accomplish. I think this is a result of his blunder with the form versus nature thing.
What page is that?
It's like on the next to last page of the next to last page of the chapter. Under the union of two natures meant, so it's his point number 2, probably somewhere in that first paragraph. He says, thus only gradually did his limited human psyche become aware of who he was and what he had come to accomplish. I think this is part of that nature versus form blunder that he made. He always knew who he was because he was who he was. Are y'all picking up the Yahweh thing there? I am who I am. Yeah. So he was who he was. I don't think there was a time that he didn't understand who he was. Now, the fullness of that, sure, but at the age of 10, he's in the temple saying, "Hey, mom and dad, don't y'all know that I had to be in my father's house?"
Yeah.
He knew where he belonged at a very young age. He was teaching the Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes. He was teaching them. He knew who he was. So I don't think that's exactly correct. And if so, then I think you would have to then start arguing that his human side was the majority and his divine side caught up to him later, which is the exact point that Dr. Erickson is making in this section, but then he argues against it, I think. So I think he always knew. That passage in Luke says that he grew in stature and favor and stature among man and God. So he grew. Yes, he did grow, but he knew who he was, and that understanding grew. Not that he came to, oh, wow, am I the Messiah? I think I'm always the Messiah. Well, I don't think it happened like that. So, number 3, In thinking about the incarnation, we must begin not with the traditional conceptions of humanity and deity, but with recognition that the two are most fully known in Jesus Christ. I love this point. Here's his point. We say, well, man can't become God. Correct. But we're starting at the wrong spot. What the Bible starts at is the perfection of Adam and Eve, right? What does Paul say? Jesus was the second Adam. So it wasn't that humanity became divine. Our whole logi, our whole locus, our whole understanding of humanity is broken because the true human is in fact Jesus. That's what this section point means. We are confused. We think that we're human. We are not. He was. Adam was. That was human as God designed human. We're some broken far side piece of what humanity is supposed to be. So whenever we say, well, humanity can't become divine, we're looking at ourselves and our own broken bodies and our own society and our cultural dimensions and all that stuff. Correct. But Jesus is the representation of humanity as it should be. So then when you look at that as the starting point, you could then say, okay, now I can see it. Does that help? Okay. I love that section. I highlighted this. I don't know if this is him or if this was me. The question then is not whether Jesus was fully human, but whether am I fully human?
Yeah, sorry. Can you explain the incarnate Christ with our understanding of God as man? Typical. I don't know how you said something before about it, but I can't figure out.
Give me more than that.
In this section for number 2, he's talking about how God came down and he limited himself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, number 2.
Flesh.
Yep.
But what does that mean to be incarnate? How is that different from our spiritual bodies as people?
Our spiritual
He's
bodies.
God, so him made incarnate.
I'm not catching your.
Or,
Okay.
Can you just explain that how he was the idea of an incarnate Christ compared to
the perfect man.
Yeah.
I guess the best way I could, taking away from the best way I can explain it is, the word became flesh.
Yeah.
Okay. The second best would be this third point, which was Jesus is the perfect human, just as Adam was the perfect human because he was the image of God.
Right.
Adam was created in the exact image of God. Hebrews says that Jesus was the exact imprint of God's character and nature. Now, the imprint is just the structure. The Philippians passage says he took the structure of humanity. Now, was he like us? No, because we are not like Adam. We've been broken. So whenever we say God man, some people shy away from saying he was slightly different than humanity, and they think that's something bad. No, I think that's right because you have to revert back several thousand years to get the genetic code and learning ability, DNA structure, lack of broken pieces of the code.
He was full. Adam was full.
Mm-hmm. And he was it's not like this humanity. We're talking perfect DNA. We're talking about the way we would expect to be in a glorified condition if we have a body.
Yeah.
But not like this structure. Back up 6,000 years or so from where Jesus was, and you have that Adam, perfect image of God. And I think that's where I need to sit is image of God imprinted on a human schemata.
Which that's why God can be incarnate in the first place, and we can't.
Right. Yeah. 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 We're a product of multiple rendition DNA failures and you know, broken pieces of strands that did this on a bad day, that on a bad day. But we do have a limited, we have a space holder for the image of God that we're born with. But only after we receive Christ is that image of God then vivified.
Yes.
It comes to life.
Right.
But even at that point, the image of God never controls our entire being because our flesh pushes back on it and restricts it. We quench the Holy Spirit. We push back on it. It never expands out to the full thing. So we will never experience what that's like. Adam had all of it. Jesus had all of it. So if I'm trying to explain, I think what he says is right. You can't start with humanity and try to figure out how deity went into it. You start with deity and say, this is how he sees humanity. And he made himself that, which is somewhat different than we are.
God to flesh, not
God to flesh.
not to-
Yeah. It's like saying, describe to me how he became fire in the bush.
Right.
Well, it's the perfect fire. It was God's fire.
Yeah.
So is that
Yeah, no,
sort of where you're going?
Yeah, that's the question. I was just trying to to get the difference between that incarnate of what we think God is already,
Right.
as flesh, and then why we can't even come close to that. But yeah, okay.
So I think that what Erickson said, I think this is Erickson. The question then is not whether Jesus was fully human, but whether we are. I think that sort of guides and informs the answer to your question,
Yeah.
how it happened. Well, we have the wrong perspective because we are not really human as designed and intended. And so whenever you realize that God made himself what was always supposed to be, now it's almost like, oh, well, that's what we're supposed to. That's not what we are. That's what we're supposed to be. So it's not like he stepped into humanity. He stepped into what humanity's penultimate moment is.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Good.
Not perfect sense, but I'm.
But I don't want to be a heretic.
Fully understand.
I don't want to be a heretic either. So
No,
there you go.
yeah.
Yeah, off to China there. Oh, we're trying. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Number 4, it says it is important to think of the initiative of the incarnation as coming from above, as it were, rather from below, which is pretty much the same point, saying this is not man becoming God, it's God taking on flesh, like we were just talking about. Number 5, whatever it was, I didn't deem it worthy, so I didn't include it. But number 6, so we have noted several dimensions of biblical truth that will help us better. Oh, this is another point. So yeah, those were the 4 that I had. There was another one in there, but I think he ran out of gas at the end and wanted a 5th point, and I don't think it really worked. But okay, here he goes. The point in this chapter I want y'all to sort of leave with several things. One, be gracious whenever people are trying to explain something that's hard. Don't pick at them to show how much smarter you are. I try to hear people and not correct their words, but try to get beyond that and get to the foundation of it. So if you feel like their foundation is okay, but their word use may be wrong, hey, show a little bit of grace. Just be nice about it, because that's what all these heretics did. Now the heresies they're really pretty simple. There's about 50 to 100 of them, but there's really only 6. He does a good job. He says, and this is like probably the last paragraph of the chapter. He says they're basically 6, all of which appeared in the first 4 Christian centuries, and now they've been repeated. They deny the genuineness of the deity of Christ or the completeness of the deity of Christ. That's 2. And then we move to humanity. They deny the genuineness of the humanity of Christ or the completeness of the humanity of Christ. And then we go into union. the unity of Christ. And so they either divide his person or confuse his person. That's really all the heresies are. You're saying he's not fully divine, or he's not really divine. He's not fully human, or he's not really human. He's part human. He's he's confused in his divinity. Those are the 6 heresies. However you manipulate it, you're still going to be in one of those 6 heresies. All right. So the typical Orthodox statement then just is, he's fully God, he's fully man. There's no division, no separation between his. He's just one nature. He is God in the flesh. I still like John. I mean, heavens be. I mean, God was so much smarter than any theologian, and he said it in 3 words as opposed to multiple books. Word became flesh. I'm good there. I have a happy space there. So I think that's where we should be as well. All right. Good. That's like one of the most confusing sections. I agree. It can be a booger bear. That's a typical term. It can be difficult, but it doesn't have to be. Just I think if you think back to John 1, Word became flesh. Okay. And I mean, I can't stress how good I think that number. I think it was number 3. He is the perfect human. He is the penultimate moment of humanity. So we are not the thing that he came into. Right? We're broken, cancerous, 90-year living, DNA carbon-based creatures. Adam, that's 1,000 years walking around on the earth. There was something different about Adam that even survived through the DNA through the years until the flood. I mean, there's something different structurally about that picture that God had of what true humanity is. So when he says that all of humanity, all the world groans, waiting for something, for the true essence of what God has planned for us, he's talking about our bodies too. And so when Jesus appeared, that structure, that form that he took, filled with God, was just something a little bit different and perfect and beyond comparison. Still human, but not like us, not because he wasn't human, because we actually aren't human. We're a cousin to what that is supposed to be. And one day, maybe we get to that spot. Good?
Yep.
All right. Oh, there we go. Do that. So sorry I didn't say body.